Subscribe to my YouTube channel, share it with your friends, and comment your thoughts. The night air was colder than Jason expected as he stepped out of the lavish downtown restaurant, the city's lights flickering like 1,000 stars scattered on the ground. He hadn't been planning on staying for dessert, but his friends had insisted, and as the evening wore on, he found himself growing increasingly restless. The clinking of glasses and laughter inside the restaurant only seemed to irritate him, more reminding him of the emptiness that lingered in his chest. Jason Jameson was a millionaire, self-made, ambitious, ruthless in the business world. He had everything a man could ever want: luxury cars, a mansion on the outskirts of the city, expensive suits tailored to perfection, and power at his fingertips. Yet, as he walked along the quiet street, surrounded by the harsh chill of the night, a sense of loneliness gnawed at him, as it always did. He shoved his hands deeper into his coat pockets, his mind drifting. The business meeting earlier that day had been intense. The deal he had been working on for months was finally in place, and now it was just about securing his company's future. Everything had to be perfect, but tonight, amidst the celebrations, something felt off. Jason wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the hollow smiles of the people around him. Maybe it was the quiet realization that despite all his wealth, he had no one to share it with. His thoughts swirled as he walked down the street, lost in the hum of the city. Then just ahead, he saw her, Sarah. She wasn't hard to spot. Her bright red scarf stood out against the darkened sidewalk, and her figure was illuminated under the faint glow of a street lamp. She was walking quickly, her pace hurried, but there was a calmness to her demeanor that caught his attention. She had been working for him for the past 6 months, an assistant at his firm, smart, diligent, and driven, but with a quiet humility that Jason had noticed from the first day she'd joined the company. She didn't fit the mold of the usual employees who threw themselves into the hustle of corporate life. Sarah had a different energy about her, one that seemed disconnected from the frantic world of power suits and boardrooms that Jason inhabited. As he continued to watch her, something else caught his eye. She was approaching a homeless man sitting on the curb. Jason had seen him before, an older man with a graying beard, his clothes ragged and worn. He sat there night after night, his cup always empty, his eyes searching the passing crowds for any sign of generosity. Jason had always kept his distance from people like him, treating them like part of the city's background noise, people you ignored to avoid the uncomfortable feeling of guilt. But as Sarah walked toward him, everything about the scene seemed to shift. Jason slowed his pace, curiosity drawing him closer. Sarah knelt down beside the homeless man, her expression softening as she spoke to him in a low voice. Jason couldn't hear the words, but he could see the interaction unfold before him. Her hands reached into her purse and pulled out what looked like a handful of bills. She placed them in the man's trembling hands, speaking to him with such kindness that it made Jason's chest tighten. For a moment, Jason was paralyzed. He stood there, hidden in the shadows, unsure of what to make of this. The woman he had only seen in a professional capacity was doing something so simple, yet so profound. She wasn't just handing him money, she was giving him dignity. She was treating him like a human being. It was a gesture Jason had never seen from anyone in his world. Sarah smiled at the man, her expression gentle, before standing up and adjusting her scarf. Jason felt a strange tug in his chest as she walked away, unaware of his presence. He didn't know why, but he felt the urge to follow her. His mind was racing, trying to understand what he had just witnessed. Why would she do that? What made her stop in the first place? He wasn't used to this kind of behavior. People in his world were transactional. Everything had a price. Every action had a motive. But Sarah, she didn't seem to live by those rules. For a moment, Jason felt something stir within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time: admiration. But that wasn't the only thing that caught his attention. As Sarah turned the corner, Jason caught sight of something else: a small, crumpled piece of paper in the man's hand. The bills had been tucked into it, but what was left was a note. Jason, still standing in the shadows, couldn't help himself. He walked closer, his curiosity overpowering any sense of restraint. He glanced down at the note just as the man unfolded it. It was short, only a few words, but what it said hit Jason harder than he anticipated. "I see you. You are not invisible." Jason froze. Something about those words lingered in his mind, their meaning far more significant than just a simple message. It was as though they spoke to something deeper inside of him, something he had ignored for too long. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice, faint but unmistakable. Sarah's voice. She was calling for him. "Jason!" He turned sharply, his heart racing, and there she was, standing at the corner, looking directly at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "I didn't expect to see you out here," Sarah said, her tone neutral but with a touch of confusion. "Are you okay?" Jason, still shaken by the scene he had just witnessed, couldn't help but feel a strange sense of vulnerability. He had spent his life building walls, ensuring that no one saw beyond the surface. But now, facing her, it felt like the walls were crumbling. "I was just walking," Jason said, his voice low. "I saw you." She nodded, her gaze briefly flicking to the homeless man, who had now stood up and disappeared into the night. There was a brief, almost imperceptible moment of silence between them. "I hope he'll be okay," Sarah murmured. Jason didn't know how to respond. What could he say? He had never cared about people like that man before. But now, for some reason, he felt the weight of his indifference more than ever. "Well," Jason said, clearing his throat, "I should get back inside. I'm sure the party's waiting for me." Sarah gave a small, understanding smile. "It was good seeing you out here." Jason watched as she turned to leave, her red scarf billowing behind her like a symbol of the kindness she had shown. As he stood there, staring at her retreating figure, something unexpected bubbled up inside him, a feeling he hadn't had in years: hope. Jason couldn't shake the image of Sarah out of his mind. It had been 2 days since he had seen her on that cold street, kneeling beside the homeless man, offering him not just money, but a piece of her humanity. He was still wrestling with the pull of that moment, that strange, inexplicable feeling he had experienced. It wasn't like him to get tangled in things like emotions or compassion, let alone make a point of thinking about someone he worked with, a mere assistant. But something in Sarah's actions stirred something inside of him. The way she had treated the homeless man, the tenderness in her voice, the way she had offered him not just money, but dignity. It haunted him. He had seen her in the office every day, but in all the years of his career, he had never witnessed anyone so selflessly human. Jason had been to dozens of charity events, fundraisers and high-end galas, but nothing had ever moved him the way Sarah's simple act of kindness had. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how different she was from everyone he had ever known. There was a purity in her, actions that was impossible to ignore. It was late afternoon when Jason found himself standing outside the office building, his fingers tapping nervously against his phone. He had been staring at her email for the last 5 minutes, unsure whether he should send a message or simply call her into his office for a conversation that might feel completely out of place. He had never reached out to any of his employees like this, especially not one as junior as Sarah. He had drafted a message earlier, something professional and polite, but it didn't feel right. He wanted to ask her more about that moment, more about why she had stopped to help. His curiosity had taken over, and now he found himself struggling to find the words. Jason clicked the screen on his phone, wiping away the draft, and instead typed, "Sarah, I've been thinking about something and I would really like to discuss it with you. Can you meet me at 7 p.m. tonight at the office? We could talk over coffee. Let me know if you're available. The message wasn't too forward, he thought, but there was a vulnerability to it that he wasn't used to. It didn't take long for her to reply. Sure, Mr. Jameson. I'll be there. The night felt like it had been drawing closer ever since. Jason hit send. His heart beat a little faster as though something was about to unfold. As the hour approached, he found himself pacing back and forth in his office, wondering what exactly it was that he hoped to discover. At 7 p.m. sharp, Sarah walked into the office. She looked as composed as always, with her neat ponytail and sensible outfit, yet there was an almost imperceptible shift in her demeanor. Jason couldn't pinpoint it, but she seemed a little more reserved tonight, perhaps sensing that something had changed between them since their encounter on the street. "Good evening," Sarah said softly, her voice calm but friendly. "You wanted to meet?" "Yeah," Jason said, standing up from his desk and gesturing toward the small coffee table in the corner of his office. "Please, have a seat." Sarah sat down across from him, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Jason paused, for a moment unsure how to begin. This wasn't a business meeting, and he didn't want it to feel like one. He had a different question in mind, a personal one. "Sarah," he began, his voice hesitant, "I wanted to ask you something. Something that's been bothering me ever since I saw you outside a couple of days ago, with that homeless man." Sarah's eyes flickered briefly, but she quickly regained her composure, nodding slowly. "I see." Jason leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Why did you do it? Why help him? You didn't have to. You could have walked right past him like everyone else." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She stared at her hands for a moment, clearly gathering her thoughts, then met his gaze. "It's not always about what we have or don't have," she said softly. "Sometimes it's about seeing others as human beings, not as people to avoid. We're all just one decision away from being in a different position." Jason felt a weight in her words. He had never considered things that way before. He was a businessman, trained to see value in people based on what they could provide. In his world, success was defined by profit, performance, and power. But Sarah's perspective, so simple yet profound, was a reminder of something he had long forgotten: humanity. "It wasn't just about the money," Sarah continued, her voice steady, yet filled with emotion. "It's about making someone feel seen when the world has ignored them for so long. It's about sharing a moment of kindness." Jason swallowed hard. He had been in meetings with CEOs and high-profile business partners, but no one had ever spoken to him like that. No one had ever challenged his view of the world so directly. "I never thought about it like that," Jason admitted, his voice tinged with both guilt and awe. "I've spent so many years focusing on success and ambition that I've lost touch with what really matters." Sarah gave a slight smile, but it wasn't one of pride. It was a quiet acknowledgement, as though she knew exactly what he was feeling. "It happens," she said simply. Jason stared at her for a moment, unsure of what to say next. He had come into this meeting wanting to learn more about her actions, but now it felt like he was learning something about himself. "What else do you do, Sarah?" he asked, his curiosity rising. "I mean, outside of work, do you volunteer often?" She hesitated. "I do when I can. I work at a local shelter a few nights a week, and sometimes I help organize community events for people in need." Jason's eyebrows raised slightly. He hadn't expected that. He had no idea Sarah was so involved in the community. She didn't fit the typical mold of someone who worked in his world, but that made him more intrigued. "I admire that," Jason said, his voice sincere. "You don't see many people like you in this city." "I don't do it for admiration," she replied quietly, but there was a softness in her words that lingered. "I just do it because I can." There was a long pause. Jason sat back in his chair, reflecting on the conversation. Sarah was unlike anyone he had ever met. Her selflessness, her commitment to something larger than herself, made him feel small in comparison, but there was something else he couldn't ignore, an undeniable pull. There was a part of him that was drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just her kindness. It was the way she viewed the world, the way she made him question his own life choices. It was the fact that he wanted to know more about her, to understand what made her tick. "Sarah," Jason said, his voice quieter now, "there's something I need to ask you. It's personal, but I have to know." Sarah looked at him, her eyes steady and unwavering. "What is it?" Jason hesitated. He had never been this vulnerable in front of anyone, especially not someone who worked for him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Sarah, something that deserved to be uncovered. "I've been thinking about you a lot," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "About your perspective on things. It's so different from mine. I want to understand more. I want to know why you choose to see the world this way, why you help when others don't." There was no turning back now. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable before she finally spoke. "Maybe it's because I've seen too much to ignore the suffering of others," she said, her voice softer now, almost as if she were revealing something she hadn't shared with anyone. "Maybe it's because I know what it feels like to be invisible, to be ignored, to be forgotten." Jason sat back in his chair, the weight of her words hitting him harder than anything he had ever experienced. He didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing. The mystery surrounding Sarah was only just beginning, and he was determined to find out more. The next few days passed in a blur for Jason. Despite his efforts to focus on business, his mind kept drifting back to Sarah. Her words, her quiet kindness, and the way she made him question everything had left a lasting impression. He had always prided himself on being in control, on making decisions that were calculated and grounded in logic. But with Sarah, it felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, leaving him unstable in a way he wasn't accustomed to. Jason spent his days in the office, his usual confidence now clouded by his thoughts of her. Every time she passed by his office, every time their eyes met across the room, there was an unspoken tension between them. He hadn't expected to feel this way. In all his years of being a millionaire, he had never been moved by someone like this, especially not an employee. Yet somehow, he couldn't push her out of his mind. It was strange to him how a simple act of kindness, something so ordinary in a different light, had turned into an obsession. He had seen people give to charity before, but the way Sarah had, given without hesitation, without the need for recognition, it was different. It was genuine. For days, Jason wrestled with his thoughts, not knowing what to make of them. The more he reflected on their conversation, the more he realized that he was fascinated by Sarah, not only because of her selflessness, but because of the quiet strength she possessed. It wasn't just the way she treated others, it was the way she carried herself, the way she seemed grounded in a world that often felt like it was spinning too fast. Yet there was still something Jason couldn't shake. Sarah had hinted at something more when she spoke of being invisible, of being ignored and forgotten. What had happened in her life to make her see the world through such a compassionate lens? Jason couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Sarah's story, something hidden beneath the surface that she wasn't ready to share. He had to know. As the days wore on, Jason began to notice small things about Sarah that stood out. She was always the first to arrive at the office and the last to leave. She worked tirelessly, her efficiency unmatched by anyone else. But even more intriguing was the quiet sadness that lingered behind her eyes. It was as though she was carrying a burden, something unspoken, something heavy. Jason found himself wondering whether this was the reason she had become so involved in helping others. Was she trying to atone for something, or was she simply trying to find a way to heal herself? By helping others heal, Jason decided that it was time to take a step forward, to understand Sarah better, to understand what made her tick. And so he reached out again. He sent her a message late one evening, asking if they could meet for dinner the next day. He didn't want it to feel like another formal meeting, another conversation about work. He wanted to know her, the real Sarah, the person behind the employee he saw in the office every day. "I was hoping we could have dinner tomorrow," he wrote. "Not for business, just to talk, if you're free." Sarah replied quickly, as she always did, with a simple, "Of course, Mr. Jameson, I'll be there." The dinner was set for a small, quiet restaurant just outside the city. It wasn't a place Jason would typically choose. He preferred the flashier, upscale spots where deals were made and business was discussed. But it felt right for this. This wasn't about business. This was about understanding. The night arrived, and Jason found himself surprisingly nervous. He had met with high-profile executives, celebrities, and politicians, but none of them had made him feel the way Sarah did. As he entered the restaurant, his eyes immediately found her sitting at a small table in the corner. She was already there, waiting, and as always, she looked composed, her hair neatly tucked behind her ear, her posture straight. But there was a gentleness in her expression that made her seem approachable, real. He walked over to the table, offering a warm smile. "Sarah, I hope I'm not keeping you waiting." She looked up and smiled, shaking her head. "Not at all. I just got here." As they sat down, Jason noticed how different this felt from their previous encounters. In the office, they had exchanged pleasantries and talked business. But now, sitting across from her, it felt like there was a deeper conversation waiting to be had. It was almost as though they were stepping into a space where vulnerability was allowed, where both of them could be honest about who they were. "So," Jason began, after a moment of silence, "tell me more about yourself, Sarah. I know so little about you, and I want to understand what drives you." Sarah paused, looking at him intently. There was something almost unreadable in her gaze. For a moment she didn't answer. Jason felt the silence stretch between them, the weight of her unspoken words heavy in the air. "I wasn't always like this," Sarah said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "I wasn't always so focused on helping others. A few years ago, I went through something that changed me, something that made me realize how fragile life can be, how much we take for granted." Jason leaned in, his curiosity piqued. He had never heard Sarah speak like this before, and the vulnerability in her voice drew him in. He wanted to know more, needed to know more. "What happened?" he asked gently, his tone sincere. Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes flickering to the window beside her, as though searching for the right words. She didn't answer immediately, but when she did, her voice trembled slightly. "I lost someone close to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My brother, he passed away unexpectedly. It was sudden. He was young, full of life, and then just like that, he was gone." Jason sat back, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had heard stories of loss before, but hearing it from someone like Sarah, someone so strong, so composed, struck him deeply. "I'm so sorry," Jason said, his voice full of sympathy. "That must have been devastating." Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It was. It still is in a way. But that's when I realized that life is too short to live without purpose. That's when I started volunteering, started giving back. I wanted to make a difference in a world that had taken so much from me." Jason's heart ached for her. He had never imagined that the kind, selfless woman he had been getting to know had carried such a painful burden. He had always admired her strength, but now, hearing her story, he saw it in an entirely new light. I can't even begin to imagine what that's like, Jason said softly, his voice full of empathy. Sarah smiled faintly. Most people can't, and that's okay, but it's why I do what I do. It's why I give, because I know what it feels like to lose something precious, and I never want anyone to feel invisible the way I felt when I lost my brother. There was a long silence between them, both of them absorbing the weight of her words. Jason was at a loss for what to say. He had spent so much of his life focused on power and wealth, yet here was Sarah, a woman who had endured immense pain, yet still chose to give instead of take. It was a humility Jason hadn't seen before, and it moved him more than he could have anticipated. Finally, Jason broke the silence. "Sarah, you're an extraordinary person. I've never met anyone like you before." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes soft, almost surprised by his words. "Thank you, but I'm just trying to live in a way that makes sense, trying to heal." Jason paused, staring at her, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. He had never been more drawn to someone in his life, not just because of her kindness, but because of her vulnerability, her honesty, and her ability to embrace life despite the pain she had endured. In that moment, Jason realized that there was something more at play here. Something beyond admiration, beyond curiosity. He was beginning to feel something for her, something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. And for the first time in a long time, Jason wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stop it. The days after their dinner meeting felt like a whirlwind for Jason. He had expected to feel a sense of relief, some sort of resolution, after learning about Sarah's past, but instead, he was left with a deeper confusion. Her story had shaken him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The strength she had shown, despite the pain of losing someone so close to her, left him in awe. He had thought that his life was complicated, that his success came at a price. But Sarah's story made him question everything he had ever valued. Jason's thoughts seemed consumed by Sarah, her quiet resilience, her unshakable sense of purpose. He tried to focus on work, but it was impossible to ignore the pull he felt every time their paths crossed. It wasn't just the attraction, although that was undeniably there. It was the way she made him see the world through a different lens, one that was no longer focused solely on power and wealth. He had always believed in self-sufficiency, in the idea that people should fend for themselves. But Sarah's kindness, her willingness to help those in need, made him wonder if he had been wrong all these years. Jason had been in meetings with powerful business partners, making deals that would secure his company's future. But it was Sarah who had made him realize that the true measure of success wasn't about accumulating wealth or climbing the corporate ladder. It was about something far more meaningful, something that had eluded him for so long: connection. But as he thought more about her, one question lingered in his mind, something he hadn't yet asked. What happened after her brother's death? How had that tragedy shaped her life so completely? It was a question Jason had been afraid to ask, unsure if Sarah was ready to delve deeper into the past she had so carefully hidden. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he needed to know. To understand her fully, he needed to understand the scars that had shaped her. One afternoon, Jason decided to reach out again. He wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but he couldn't ignore the urge to learn more about Sarah, about her pain, her resilience, and the person she had become because of it. He sat in his office, the walls feeling more like a cage than a sanctuary, his mind racing as he typed out a message. He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard before finally typing. "Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, and there's something I want to ask you. I understand if you're not ready to talk about it, but if you are, I'd like to know more about what happened after your brother's death." I want to understand what you went through." The message felt too direct, too personal, but Jason couldn't hold back. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. It didn't take long for Sarah to reply. "Jason, I don't know if I'm ready to share everything with you, but I trust you. I'll meet you tonight at the same place. 7 p.m. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he read the message. She was willing to open up, to share the parts of her story that she had kept hidden. But he knew that hearing her truth would change things, perhaps in ways he wasn't prepared for. That evening, as Jason made his way to the quiet restaurant where they had met before, his mind raced. He knew this conversation would be difficult, but he was also prepared for the raw honesty that Sarah had shown him in their previous encounters. When he arrived, Sarah was already there, sitting at the same table in the corner. She looked calm, but Jason could see the tension in her eyes. He could feel it too. This was more than just another conversation. This was a moment of truth, and everything between them could shift in an instant. "Sarah," Jason said as he took a seat across from her, "thank you for meeting me." She gave a small nod, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that was hard to read. "I know you've been thinking about it, about me, about what happened." Jason didn't know how to respond. He had no idea what kind of pain she had endured, but he wanted to be there for her, no matter how difficult it might be to hear. He nodded. "I just want to understand you better. I want to know the real Sarah." Sarah's eyes softened, and for a moment she looked almost like the person she had been before the tragedy, the compassionate, kind woman who had been helping others, despite her own struggles. But then the mask slipped, and Jason saw something else in her eyes: pain, guilt, regret. "I've never told anyone this," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly. "Not even my closest friends, but I think you deserve to know." Jason leaned in, his breath held in anticipation. "I wasn't always the person you see now," Sarah said. "Before my brother died, I was different. I was angry. I had a lot of unresolved issues with him, with my family. My brother, his name was Lucas. He and I used to fight all the time. We didn't always get along, and after he died, I couldn't help but feel like I was responsible." Jason's heart sank. He hadn't expected this. He had assumed Sarah's grief was simple, a tragic loss of someone she loved deeply. But this was more complicated, more painful. "Responsible?" Jason asked, his voice gentle. Sarah nodded, her eyes darkening with the weight of the memories. "He was my younger brother. We were close when we were kids, but as we grew older, things changed. I pushed him away. I thought he was making bad decisions, drinking, getting involved with the wrong crowd. I tried to control him, tried to tell him what to do, but he didn't listen. The last words we ever said to each other were cruel. I yelled at him, told him he'd never amount to anything, and then he was gone." Jason didn't know what to say. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he knew that words wouldn't be enough. He could see the pain in her eyes, the guilt that weighed heavily on her shoulders. It was clear that Sarah had been carrying this burden for a long time, and no amount of kindness or charity could ease the guilt that had taken root in her heart. "I don't think I've ever forgiven myself for that," Sarah continued, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought that if I had been kinder, if I had listened to him, maybe he would still be here." Jason's heart went out to her. He had never been in her shoes, never lost someone so close to him and felt responsible for it. But he understood the weight of guilt, the way it could eat away at you, making you question every decision, every action. "I didn't know," Jason said quietly, his voice filled with sympathy. "I had no idea you were carrying all of that." Sarah shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. No one knows. I didn't want anyone to know, but maybe telling you will help me let go of it. Maybe I can finally forgive myself." Jason reached across the table, his hand resting gently over hers. He didn't know what else to say, but the gesture seemed to comfort her, if only for a moment. He understood now, understood why Sarah had chosen to dedicate her life to helping others. It wasn't just about charity. It was about redemption. It was about trying to make up for the mistakes she felt she couldn't undo. "Sarah," Jason said softly, his voice filled with empathy, "you don't have to carry this alone anymore. You're not responsible for what happened. People change, and sometimes we don't get the chance to fix things. But that doesn't mean you're to blame." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "But how do I forgive myself?" Jason smiled gently. "You start by accepting that you can't change the past. But you can choose to be better. You can choose to help others, to be the person you needed when you were struggling. You've already done that. You've made a difference in so many people's lives, including mine." For a moment, the weight of Sarah's past seemed to lift, if only slightly. She smiled, a small, tentative smile, but it was enough. It was a start. Jason knew that Sarah's journey wasn't over, that healing took time, but for the first time, he believed she was ready to move forward. And he wanted to be there with her, to help her in whatever way he could. The days following their conversation at the restaurant felt like they were both walking on a new path, one that was fraught with uncertainty, but also tinged with the promise of something more. Jason had never known a woman like Sarah. She was raw and real, in a way that few people ever allowed themselves to be. The conversation they had shared was a turning point for both of them. For Sarah, it was a moment of release, a chance to speak the words she had been holding on to for so long. For Jason, it was a revelation, an understanding of who she truly was beyond the woman he had initially seen in the office. But despite the small progress they had made, Jason knew that there was more to Sarah's story. Something she still hadn't shared, something that continued to cast a shadow over her. He could sense it every time they were together. The vulnerability was there, but so was the quiet strength, the shield she had built around herself to protect her from the world. He had seen her offer her heart to so many others, but she had never fully opened up to him, not until now. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah's presence became more consuming for Jason. He found himself thinking about her during meetings, during his evening walks, and even in the rare moments when he tried to sleep. There was something about her that captivated him, something about her willingness to embrace the pain and beauty of life with such grace. She made him question the very foundation of his own existence, the pursuit of success, wealth, and power. Things he had always deemed essential, but now seemed so empty in comparison to the depth of Sarah's character. But there was still one question that haunted him. What had really happened to Sarah's brother, Lucas? The guilt she had spoken of was more than just grief. It felt like there was something deeper, something unresolved that she wasn't telling him. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that the tragedy that had shaped Sarah's life was still a puzzle, missing a crucial piece. One evening, unable to contain his curiosity any longer, Jason sent Sarah a message asking if they could meet again. This time, it wasn't just about sharing stories. This time he needed answers. "Sarah, I know I've asked a lot of you already, but there's something I need to understand. Something that's been bothering me. I hope we can meet again tonight, at the same place, 7 p.m. As expected, Sarah replied almost immediately. "I'll be there, Jason. I think it's time." Jason's heart raced as he read her response. There was a heaviness in her words, an acknowledgement that the conversation they were about to have would go deeper than anything they had shared before. He didn't know what she was about to reveal, but he knew it would change everything. By the time he arrived at the restaurant, his mind was already racing, his thoughts tangled in knots. As usual, Sarah was already there, sitting at the same corner table, her posture relaxed, but her eyes betraying a quiet intensity. She was waiting for him, and Jason could feel the weight of the unspoken words between them. He sat down across from her, his gaze searching her face. There was an almost palpable tension in the air, an anticipation that hung heavy in the silence. "Sarah," Jason said, his voice quiet but filled with concern, "I've been thinking about everything you shared with me, and I feel like there's something you're still holding back. I want to understand what really happened with Lucas, what you haven't told me." Sarah's expression faltered for a moment, a shadow crossing her face. For a brief instant, Jason saw the woman he had first met, guarded, cautious, unsure whether to trust. But then just as quickly, her walls came down. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them on the table. "Jason," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I didn't want to tell you this. I didn't want you to know everything about me. But I think it's time you understood." Jason leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew that this moment would change everything. "You're right," Sarah continued, her eyes meeting his with a depth that was both painful and vulnerable. "There's more to the story, much more than I've ever told anyone, and it's not just about Lucas, it's about what happened to me after he died." Jason felt a chill run through him. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what she was about to say, but he couldn't turn back now. He needed to know. "After Lucas died," Sarah said slowly, her voice trembling with emotion, "I went into a spiral. I couldn't cope with the grief, the guilt, and I did things I'm not proud of." Jason remained silent, waiting for her to continue. His mind raced, trying to piece together what she was saying. What kind of things had she done? "I turned to alcohol, to numb the pain," Sarah confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I started drinking heavily. I pushed everyone away, even my closest friends. I didn't care anymore. I didn't know how to deal with the emptiness that had taken over me. I thought that if I could just forget for a while, maybe the pain would go away. But it didn't." Jason felt his heart break for her. He had known that Sarah had struggled, but hearing it from her, hearing the raw honesty in her voice, hit him harder than he could have imagined. She wasn't just mourning the loss of her brother, she was mourning the loss of herself. The guilt she had carried had driven her to a place where she couldn't see a way out. "I remember one night," Sarah continued, her eyes distant as she relived the memory. "I drank more than I ever had before. I was at a bar, and I ran into someone. He was bad for me, a man who took advantage of my grief. He promised to take away the pain, to make me forget. And for a while, it worked." Jason's stomach churned at her words. He couldn't fathom the darkness she had been through, the way her grief had twisted her reality, making her vulnerable to someone who would only take advantage of her. It was hard to believe that the strong, kind woman in front of him had once been so lost. "But it didn't last," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Eventually, I hit rock bottom. I realized what I was doing, and I knew I had to stop. I couldn't keep living like that. I had to find a way to heal, to move forward. That's when I started volunteering, giving back, trying to make a difference in the lives of others. I wanted to find some meaning in all the chaos. I wanted to make up for the mistakes I had made." Jason sat back, the weight of her confession heavy in the air. He had known that Sarah was a woman of depth, but this was more than he had ever imagined. It was clear now that her journey wasn't just about redemption, it was about survival. She had fought to overcome her past, to rebuild herself from the wreckage of her grief and guilt. And she had done it alone. "I've never told anyone this," Sarah whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I've never wanted anyone to see me as weak, but I think it's time for you to know the truth." Jason reached across the table, his hand gently resting on hers. "Sarah, you're not weak. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known. You've fought through so much, and you're still standing. That's not weakness, that's courage." Sarah's eyes met his, and for the first time, she allowed herself to be vulnerable in front of him. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Jason smiled, squeezing her hand gently. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her go through this alone anymore. They had both come to this moment in their lives, this point where the past could no longer be ignored, where the truth had to be faced. And together, they would find a way forward. The days after their conversation were like a haze for Sarah. The weight of everything she had shared with Jason, the guilt, the pain, the raw vulnerability, had left her both relieved and exhausted. She had opened herself to him in a way that she had never done with anyone else. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she wasn't carrying her burdens alone. Jason had been the first person to truly see her, not as the selfless woman she appeared to be on the surface, but as the person she had been before the pain had consumed her. And in his eyes, she hadn't seen judgment. She had only seen acceptance, but the relief was tempered with uncertainty. As much as she wanted to move forward, Sarah knew that her journey was far from over. The scars of her past were not easily erased, and the guilt still lingered, sometimes haunting her when the silence grew too loud. She had spent years building walls around herself, and while Jason had knocked down many of those walls, there were still parts of her that were afraid to let go completely. Jason, on the other hand, was more certain than ever that the connection they shared was something real. He had come to admire Sarah, not just for the person she was in the office, but for the strength she had shown in the face of her darkest moments. Her courage to face the truth about her past had made him see the world in a new light. For the first time, he understood that success wasn't just about wealth or power. It was about the relationships you built, the lives you touched, and the way you helped others heal. Jason had known he wanted something more with Sarah, but now he wasn't sure what form that would take. They had both been through so much. She had healed in ways he could never fully understand, and yet Jason knew that their connection had the potential to help them both grow. But before he could make any decisions, he needed to know if Sarah was ready to take that step too. It was a quiet evening when Jason received a call from Sarah. His heart leapt in his chest as he saw her name flash across his phone. The last few weeks had been filled with the unspoken tension between them, and as much as they had shared, Jason knew they had only begun to scratch the surface of their feelings for one another. "Jason." Sarah's voice was soft, but there was a new kind of resolve in it. "I need to talk to you. Can you meet me tomorrow evening? I think I'm ready to take the next step." Jason felt a surge of hope in his chest. For all that had been unsaid, he had never doubted the bond they shared. But hearing Sarah's words, hearing the certainty in her voice, filled him with a new sense of possibility. He immediately agreed to meet her. The next evening, they met at the same restaurant. This time, though, there was no hesitation in Sarah's eyes. She was different. The weight that had once been visible in her gaze seemed to have lifted, and there was a lightness in her presence that Jason had never seen before. She was still the same woman, strong, compassionate, and selfless, but there was a newfound confidence in the way she held herself. It was as if, after everything she had gone through, she had finally made peace with who she was. "Sarah," Jason said, as he took a seat across from her, his voice filled with admiration. "You look different. You look at peace." She smiled, softly, a gentle warmth in her expression. "I think I am. I've been carrying around so much for so long, but after everything we've talked about, I finally feel like I can breathe again." I'm no longer running from my past. Jason nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. He had watched Sarah struggle to let go of her guilt, her pain, and the weight of her past. But now he saw a woman who had finally embraced her truth. She wasn't perfect, but she was strong, and in that strength she had found her way back to herself. I've thought a lot about what we've shared, Sarah continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. And I realized something. I've spent so many years feeling like I had to fix everything on my own. But I don't have to do this alone anymore, and neither do you. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he processed her words. He had always believed in doing things on his own, in building his success and handling his emotions in isolation. But Sarah had taught him a different lesson, that sometimes the greatest strength came from allowing yourself to rely on others, to open yourself up and let someone in. I never knew how much I needed someone like you in my life, Jason said, quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. You've shown me that there's more to life than just business and success. You've made me see that the real worth of life comes from the connections we build and the people we help. Sarah's eyes softened as she reached across the table, her hand resting gently over his. I feel the same way, Jason. You've shown me that I don't have to carry everything alone, and for that, I'm grateful. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their words settling between them. They had come a long way, from the moment they first met in the office to the raw honesty they had shared about their pasts. They had both faced their demons, and now they were ready to move forward together. Jason didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he wanted Sarah in it. He had never felt more certain about anything in his life. The woman sitting across from him had not only healed herself, but had taught him how to open his heart to others. And for that, he would be forever grateful. Sarah, Jason said, his voice filled with tenderness, I don't know what the future holds, but I want to be there with you, through everything, whatever comes next. Sarah smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. I want that too, Jason. I think we both deserve to have someone who sees us for who we truly are, not just for what we've done or what we've achieved. As they sat there, hands intertwined, a sense of peace washed over them. The journey they had taken, through pain, loss, and self-discovery, had led them to this moment. They weren't just two people bound by shared experiences. They were two people who had found a connection that went beyond the surface. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she had found a place where she truly belonged. A place where she was seen, heard, and loved for who she was. Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a delicate silver bracelet, simple yet beautiful, much like the bond they had built together. Sarah, I know this is soon, and maybe I'm rushing things, but I want you to know how much you mean to me. Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with surprise. Jason smiled, his heart pounding in his chest. I don't want to wait anymore. I don't want to waste time wondering what could be. I want to start this journey with you, now, without any more hesitation. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she gazed at him, overwhelmed by the love and sincerity in his gesture. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Jason, I want that too. They stood up, the weight of the moment settling. It wasn't about the bracelet. It wasn't even about the future they had yet to create. It was about the trust they had built, the healing they had both gone through, and the love that had blossomed between them. And as they embraced, holding each other tightly, they both knew that this was just the beginning of something beautiful. The lesson as the story comes to a close, it's clear that the journey Sarah and Jason have taken is one of personal transformation. Sarah's journey wasn't just about overcoming grief and guilt. It was about finding the strength to open up, to let others in, and to realize that healing doesn't have to be a solitary endeavor. For Jason, it was a lesson in vulnerability, in recognizing that true success doesn't come from wealth or status, but from the connections we build with others and the lives we touch along the way. The final lesson is simple yet profound. Healing, growth and love come from embracing both the light and the darkness within us. It's about accepting our past, learning from it, and using it as a foundation for a better future. Together, Jason and Sarah have built something meaningful. Not just a relationship, but a life full of understanding, empathy, and love. And, as they step forward into their future, they know that whatever comes, they will face it together. The end.